Catherine Mary. Just before sunrise on February 29, 2000, police in New South Wales got a call that would lead them to something absolutely nightmarish. In Aberdeen, this quiet little town tucked away in the Upper Hunter region, detectives walked into a house and found a crime scene that nobody could have prepared for. A woman called Catherine Mary Knight had done something so brutal, so unthinkable, that even cops who'd seen it all were left stunned. What happened in that house became one of the darkest chapters in Australian crime history. Catherine was 44 years old at the time, living in Aberdeen, a small rural community where everyone pretty much knew everyone. Her life had always been rough around the edges. Violence, obsession, psychological chaos had all seemed to follow her. Her relationship with John Charles Thomas Price, the man she was living with, had been getting worse and worse. They'd been together for years, but things had spiraled so badly that John finally snapped and took out a restraining order against her. That was just one day before everything went to hell. He knew something bad was coming. You could tell he felt it. He even told his mates at work that if he didn't show up the next morning, they should assume Catherine had killed him. Turns out, his gut feeling was spot on. On the night of February 28th, while John was asleep, Catherine came into his house. What happened next was pure savagery. She stabbed him 37 times with a butcher's knife. Eventually, Catherine's mind seemed to snap back to some kind of reality. She tried to kill herself. The next day, police found her unconscious in the house. When they revived her and she had to face what she'd actually done, there was no denying the horror of it all. Catherine Knight was arrested and charged with murder. She went down in history as the first woman in Australia to be sentenced to life in prison without any chance of parole. The judge made it crystal clear she was far too dangerous to ever walk free again. The whole country reeled from it. It was a brutal reminder that sometimes the worst kind of violence happens right behind closed doors, in places you'd never expect. Robert Paul Long. But Catherine Knight's horrific crime wasn't going to stand alone for long. Just a few months later, in the quiet Queensland town of Childers, another tragedy hit, one that would shake the country's sense of safety to its core. In June 2000, the Palace Backpackers Hostel in Childers was packed with young travelers from all over the world. You had Europeans, Australians, people just passing through the Queensland outback looking for adventure, maybe some seasonal work, a bit of excitement. On the night of June 23rd, there were about 84 people crashed out in this old converted heritage building, totally unaware that someone among them was about to do something unthinkable. Robert Paul Long, a 49-year-old fruit picker, had been kicked out of the hostel not long before for not paying his rent, and he wasn't happy about it. In fact, he had this deep, festering anger toward backpackers in general. That anger was about to turn into something horrifying. Long decided to set the place on fire. He started it in the recreation room downstairs, and the whole building just went up. Now, here's the thing: the hostel didn't have working smoke detectors. The emergency lighting had been turned off or wasn't functioning. So, when the fire started spreading, people woke up in total darkness, choking on smoke, completely disoriented. Some of them couldn't even find the exits because flames had already blocked the way out. The fire tore through that old timber building like it was made of paper. Screams filled the halls as people scrambled to survive. By the time firefighters got there, it was already too late for some. 15 people died that night. 9 of them were women. The survivors who made it out had heartbreaking stories. Too late for some. 15 people died that night. 9 of them were women. The survivors who made it out had heartbreaking stories trying to save their friends, getting separated in the smoke and chaos, never seeing them again. The hostel turned into a death trap for young people who'd done absolutely nothing wrong. They came to Australia for an adventure, to make memories, to experience something new. Instead, they never made it home. Robert Paul Long got arrested pretty quickly. At first, they charged him with arson and 2 counts of murder. He tried to shift the blame, saying that if the smoke alarms had been working, nobody would have died. He pointed fingers at the building's safety failures, but the evidence didn't lie. Long set that fire on purpose. The jury found him guilty, and in 2002, he was sentenced to life in prison. He became eligible for parole in 2020, which is something that still haunts the families of those 15 victims. Because while he might one day walk free, their loved ones never will. By Peter Norris. To pass a year 2000 just kept getting darker. Over in Melbourne, Victoria, a serial killer was already out there, hunting in the shadows. His name was Peter Norris Dupas, and he had a long, ugly history of violent sexual crimes. Going back to the 70s and 80s, he'd been arrested over and over again: rape, false imprisonment, assault. But every single time, he got out, and every time they let him back into society, he just got worse. More violent, more dangerous, more predatory. On April 19, 1999, a woman named Nicole Patterson got a phone call. Nicole was 28 years old, a psychotherapist and youth counselor trying to help people. The caller said he needed therapy, wanted to book an appointment. She agreed to see him at her home office in Northcote. That one decision ended up costing her everything. When Peter Dupas showed up at her door, pretending to be a client, he had a knife on him. He stabbed Nicole 27 times. The attack was vicious, frenzied, blood everywhere. The brutality of it was almost impossible to wrap your head around. But Nicole wasn't going to be his only victim. As the police dug deeper, they started connecting the dots. Dupas had also murdered a woman named Margaret Marr back in October 1997. She was 40 years old. And just like Nicole, she'd been stabbed over and over again. The pattern was there. This wasn't random. This was the work of someone with a deep, twisted hatred of women. Then they found another victim, Mersina Halvages, killed in 1997, and there were likely others. What eventually tied Dupas to these murders was a horrifying forensic detail. He'd removed the breasts of his victims. It was a signature so specific, so sickening, that it could only point to one person. On August 22, 2000, Peter Dupas was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for Nicole Patterson's murder. Later on, he got hit with 2 more life sentences for the other killings. He'd spend the rest of his days locked up. His violence finally stopped. But the damage he did, the pain he left behind for the families and friends of those women, that never goes away. Those scars don't heal. Mark Valera down in Wollongong, New South Wales, this industrial city on the coast. Another young man was about to unleash a level of violence that would leave even the most experienced detectives shaken. Mark Valera was only 19 years old, but his childhood had been a nightmare. His father had abused him, physically and sexually, warping his mind in ways that no kid should ever have to endure. And on the night he snapped, Valera committed acts so twisted and brutal that at first, investigators thought they were dealing with some kind of satanic cult. Valera murdered his neighbor, a man named David O'Hearn. The violence was extreme. O'Hearn's head had been bashed in with a wine decanter. But that was just the beginning. A few days later, Valera killed again. This time, his victim was Frank Arkle, a man who had a history of child sexual abuse. Once again, the mutilation was horrific. Valera drove tie pins into Arkle's eyes and cheeks. Jeffrey Robert Dobbs's The New Millennium rolled on. Australia had to face yet another kind of evil, one that hid behind trust and authority. In Queensland, a man named Jeffrey Robert Dobbs had spent decades using his position to prey on the most vulnerable. He was a teacher and a youth care worker, someone who was supposed to protect kids. Instead, he used that access to abuse them. From 1972 all the way through to 2000, Dobbs systematically abused at least 63 girls. He exploited their youth, their trust, their vulnerability, all for his own sick gratification. The sheer scale of what he did is almost impossible to comprehend. And the real number of victims, it might never be fully known. Dobbs was finally arrested in 2000 after years of getting away with it. He pleaded guilty to 124 sex offenses against 63 girls who were in his care. During the court proceedings, the evidence laid out just how calculated and methodical he'd been. He groomed these children. He used his authority to silence them. He made them feel like they couldn't speak up. At his sentencing, the judge made it absolutely clear Dobbs would never see the outside of a prison again. He was considered far too dangerous to ever be released. He was given an indefinite sentence, meaning he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars. His case was a brutal reminder that sometimes the people society trusts the most, teachers, caregivers, authority figures, can turn out to be the most dangerous predators of all. Brett Peter Cowan. The early 2000s just kept bringing one horror after another. On December 7, 2003, a 13-year-old boy named Daniel Morecambe vanished from the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. He'd been waiting for a bus in broad daylight when he was abducted by a predator named Brett Peter Cowan, man who already had a history of sexually abusing children. Daniel's disappearance set off what would become the biggest, most high-profile criminal investigation in Queensland's history. For 8 long years, his family lived in absolute agony, not knowing if their son was alive or dead, not knowing what had happened to him. The investigation dragged on, but eventually, police came up with an innovative and controversial undercover technique called the Mr. Big Operation. Basically, detectives created this elaborate fake criminal organization designed to get Cowan to trust them and confess. Undercover operatives spent months building a relationship with him, slowly drawing him in with the promise of being part of a serious criminal crew. In August 2011, Cowan finally cracked. He admitted to murdering Daniel, and more than that, he actually led the undercover cops to the spot where he'd buried Daniel's body. When Daniel Morecambe's remains were finally recovered on August 17, 2011, his family could at least begin to grieve properly, but the loss was permanent. Nothing could bring him back. At Cowan's trial in 2014, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The court heard all about his previous convictions for abusing children, his predatory nature, the cold, calculated way he'd abducted and killed Daniel. The case drew worldwide attention, not just because of the tragedy, but because of the Mr. Big technique. It sparked a lot of debate about how far police should go when investigating crimes against children. Carl Williams. Around the same time Daniel Morecambe's case was all over the news, Melbourne was going through something completely different but just as violent, an all-out war in the city's criminal underworld. Gangsters were dropping like flies, and at the center of it all was a drug trafficker named Carl Williams. He was orchestrating multiple contract killings, And what started as a dispute between rival drug crews turned into a full-blown war for control of Melbourne's entire criminal empire. Carl Williams hadn't always been a big name in the underworld. He was actually a pretty minor player at first, but then he got into it with the Moran family, who basically ran Melbourne's drug trade at the time. On his 29th birthday in 1999, Jason Moran shot him in the stomach. Williams survived, but his pride took a hit just as bad as his body did. And that's when he decided he was done playing he was going to take revenge on everyone he thought had wronged him. Over the next few years, he ordered the murders of at least 3 people that we know of for sure, though he was suspected of being involved in a lot more deaths than that. The bodies just kept piling up. Louis Moran, the old patriarch of the Moran family, was shot and killed in 2004. His son Jason, the one who'd shot Williams years earlier, was murdered in 2003. Other rival criminals started falling too, their bodies turning up all over Melbourne. The police eventually set up a special task force called Piranha, just to deal with the gangland killings. In total, 36 underworld figures were murdered between 1998 and 2010, during what became known as the Melbourne Gangland War. Carl Williams's reign finally came to an end when he got arrested and charged. In February 2007, he pleaded guilty to 3 of the murders he'd ordered, and the court sentenced him to life with a 35-year non-parole period. He was never getting out. It seemed like justice had been served. But then, on April 19, 2010, Williams was murdered in his own prison cell by another inmate, a guy named Matthew Johnson, who beat him to death using the stem of an exercise bike as a weapon. Even locked up behind bars, violence found a way to catch up with him. Another one of Australia's most dangerous criminals, gone. Robert Farquharson, September 4, 2005. Something happened on a highway near the small town of Winchelsea in Victoria that would tear the country apart and make everyone question what they thought they knew about guilt and innocence. Robert Farquharson was driving his 3 young sons Jai, Jack, and Tyler back home after a Father's Day visit. They were heading along the Prince's Highway when suddenly, his white Commodore swerved hard to the left, smashed through a fence, and plunged straight into a disused quarry that had been turned into a farm dam. The dam was over 7 meters deep. Water flooded into the car, and it started sinking fast. Farquharson somehow managed to get out and call for help, but his 3 boys were trapped inside. Jai's body was found hanging out of the front door. Jack and Tyler were still in the back seat, not even wearing seatbelts, stuck in their watery grave. The whole nation was horrified. At first, everyone felt nothing but sympathy for people saw him as a devastated father who'd just lost everything in a terrible accident. But then the police started digging deeper, and things didn't add up. When they analyzed the steering wheel, it looked like Farquharson had deliberately cranked it to the left, something that just wouldn't happen in a normal accident. There were no skid marks, no signs of braking. Witnesses said that Farquharson had twice refused to call emergency services, like he wasn't even worried about his kids. They gave him a lie detector test, and while it couldn't be used in court, it suggested he was lying. Farquharson claimed he'd had a coughing fit and blacked out, but medical experts said that was extremely rare and highly unlikely. In December 2005, Farquharson was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. The trial was brutal. The jury had to decide if his story was true or if he'd actually murdered his own children. They looked at the physics of the crash, how the car behaved, and what Farquharson did before and after it happened. In the end, the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. Farquharson has never stopped saying he's innocent, and his case is still one of the most controversial murder trials in Australia. Experts are still arguing to this day about whether justice was done or if an innocent man is sitting in prison for a tragic accident. Adrian Ernest Bailey fast forward to 2012, and Melbourne was rocked by another shocking murder that brought the entire nation together in grief and anger. A young Irish woman named Jill Marr had moved to Australia looking for a fresh start. She worked at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, a solid, respected job that showed just how smart and ambitious she was. She'd settled into Melbourne's community, going out with friends and coworkers, living the life she'd always wanted. On the night of September 21, 2012, Jill was out having drinks with her coworkers at a bar in Brunswick, a suburb in Melbourne. As the night went on and her friends headed home, Jill decided to walk back to her place. It wasn't far at all. She'd walked it countless times before. It should have been a simple 10-minute walk, but it ended up being the last walk she'd ever take. Adrian Ernest Bailey, a serial rapist and violent predator who'd been let out on parole despite a horrifying history of sexual assaults, ran into Jill on the street. He attacked her, dragged her into a laneway, raped her, and then strangled her to death with his bare hands. Watching as the life drained out of her 6 days later, Jill's body was found buried in a shallow grave on the outskirts of Melbourne. Adrian Bailey, who was on parole for previous rape convictions and was actually out on bail for another assault at the time he killed Jill, was arrested. He eventually pleaded guilty to her rape and murder. He got life in prison with a minimum of 35 years before he'd even be considered for parole. the case exploded into a massive conversation about the parole system, how dangerous predators like Bailey were being let back out into the community, and how badly the system was failing to protect people. 30,000 people flooded the streets of Melbourne after Jill's death. They were grieving, they were angry, and they were demanding change. Her murder triggered inquiries into Victoria's parole system. It exposed how poorly dangerous offenders were being monitored and supervised. For Jill's family back in Ireland, the loss was unbearable. A young woman with her entire life ahead of her had been stolen from the world by a system that had completely failed to keep a predator locked up. Merson, Fatibit, even for people who've seen the worst of the worst. Human depravity can still find a way to shock. In Queensland, a mentally ill woman named Merson Thade committed an act so horrifying and tragic that it forced everyone to ask hard questions about criminal responsibility and how we treat people with severe mental illness. On March 29, 2010, Merson Thade stabbed her 8 children to death in their home in Waterford, Queensland. 8 kids. The youngest was just 2 years old. The oldest was 14. They were murdered by the one person who was supposed to protect them, above all else their own mother. Thade suffered from severe, untreated schizophrenia, and in the months leading up to the killings, her mental state had been spiraling. She'd become convinced that she was the chosen one, that she had some kind of divine mission to cleanse her family of demonic forces. The final trigger came when she heard a dove calling. In her delusional mind, she interpreted that sound as a message from God. She believed she was being commanded to kill her children, to save them. In a psychotic episode that's almost impossible to comprehend, she stabbed her children over and over again, thinking she was doing something holy, something necessary. When the police arrived, they found Merson standing outside her house with 35 self-inflicted stab wounds in her chest and neck. She'd stabbed herself so badly that she'd punctured her own lung. The case brought up some really deep, difficult questions about criminal law and responsibility. Can someone so completely detached from reality because of mental illness be held criminally responsible for what they've done? Queensland's mental health court ruled that Merson Thade was unfit to plead and wasn't criminally responsible because of her severe mental illness. She was sent to a mental health facility instead of prison. Some people saw that as the right call, a merciful decision. Others felt like it wasn't enough not for the deaths of 8 innocent children. Closing every single one of these cases has left deep scars in the communities they touched. Every one of them has sparked debates about justice, about how to prevent something like this from happening again, about what it means to be responsible for your actions. The families of the victims have been forced to live with a loss that doesn't make sense, that can never be made right. And the perpetrators, they're locked up in prison or committed to mental health facilities have become part of Australia's darker history. These crimes are a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't come with a warning label. A lot of the time, it wears the face of someone you know, a partner, a teacher, a coworker, a family member. It can strike out of nowhere, in a moment of rage, or it can unfold slowly over years, hiding in plain sight. It can come from mental illness, from childhood trauma, from the twisted world of organized crime. Australia, like every other country, has to stay alert to the darkness that can come from within its own communities. And we have to remember the names and the stories of the people we've lost to violence. We owe it to them to never forget and to hope that by remembering, we can somehow prevent others from suffering the same fate.